So, if you look at a traditional military map from the 20th century, there's a comforting, almost mathematical simplicity to it.
Absolutely. It's very clean.
Yeah, exactly. You have this defined geography. You have a space with, clear front lines drawn in red and blue. You picture a clearly identified enemy wearing a uniform, and it's a clash of conventional armies.
Right.
And victory in that scenario is measured in, I don't know, the sheer tonnage of machinery destroyed or the square mileage of territory you gained.
Yeah, it's a very linear Newtonian way of thinking about conflict.
Yeah.
You apply mass to a specific point, you take the hill, you hold the hill, and you win the war.
Right. But as a dedicated student of irregular warfare, you already know that the modern landscape of conflict has completely shattered that old paradigm.
Completely.
You step into the world of modern strategic competition, and suddenly that physical map is dangerously obsolete. We're looking at a battlefield that is hidden, it's infinitely adaptable, and frankly, it's operating everywhere all at once.
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, it's inside the banking system, it's woven into civilian infrastructure, and it's even buried in the supply chains of the very equipment our military relies on.
Right. Because in today's operational environment, warfare is far less about destroying a conventional army in the field and much more about understanding the hidden nodes, the invisible links, and really the financial lifebloods that sustain these highly adaptive adversaries.
Yeah.
Because if you can't map the unseen network, you just can't fight the war.
Which is the core mission of this deep dive. We are unpacking the strategic framework for countering threat networks. We're moving far beyond those traditional nation-state battlefield tactics to understand exactly how adversaries use complex, interwoven networks to achieve their strategic goals.
Right.
And more importantly, how military planners actually go about dismantling them. So to do this, we're drawing on three really foundational texts.
Great text, yeah.
Yeah. First, the manual Understanding Irregular Warfare. Then we've got the highly detailed joint publication 3-25, Countering Threat Networks. And finally, a really illuminating article titled Counter-Threat Finance for Strategic Competition by Kevin D. Stringer, Madison Urban, and Andrew McKay.
And, these texts are critical because they really represent the bleeding edge of how military strategy is evolving.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to meet adversaries who frankly refuse to fight us tank for tank. They're operating in the seams of our own societies, weaponizing the globalized systems that we built.
So let's just start with the anatomy of the beast itself. According to the joint publication on countering threat networks, before you can dismantle an organization, you really have to break it down into its fundamental building blocks.
Right.
The text defines these networks, whether they're drug cartels, insurgent groups, or, global terrorist organizations, using three core components: nodes, links, and cells.
Yeah, and the terminology here is essential for planners. So a node is your foundational element. It represents a person, a place, or a physical object.
Okay.
It's a tangible point in the operational environment. So a node could be a specific local financier. It could be a safe house used to hide weapons, or even a particular border crossing point where corrupt guards are operating.
Right, but isolated nodes don't really pose a strategic threat, do they? I mean, a stockpile of weapons just sitting in a cave, or a single radicalized individual, that doesn't constitute a network until there's interconnectivity.
Exactly.
And that's where links come in. A link is the behavioral, physical, or functional relationship between those nodes. It's the connective tissue.
And those links take a lot of different forms. I mean, a link could be a blood or family tie, which, by the way, is incredibly difficult for outside intelligence to penetrate.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. Or it could be a shared religious or ideological belief.
Yeah.
Or on a more practical level, it could be a series of financial transactions or a secure encrypted communications channel.
Right.
And when you combine those nodes and those links to accomplish a specific function, that's when you get the third component: cells.
Okay, so what exactly is a cell in this context?
A cell is a subordinate organization that's formed around a specific process or capability within the larger network.
Right. So a network doesn't just have everyone doing everything all at once. You might have a logistics cell dedicated strictly to moving illicit materials across a border.
Right.
And then an operational cell dedicated to carrying out the actual physical attacks. And maybe a highly sophisticated finance cell dedicated entirely to laundering money through front companies. They specialize, which is what makes them so efficient.
They do specialize.
Yeah.
But we have to complicate the picture even further.
Of course we do.
Because military planners aren't dealing with these networks in a vacuum, right? The joint publication emphasizes a concept called the network of networks.
Network of networks, okay.
Yeah, threat networks are constantly interacting with, hiding within, and exploiting neutral and sometimes even friendly networks. Yeah. We're seeing this massive convergence of illicit activities. Modern threat networks operate in these gray zones, and they seamlessly blend terrorist, insurgent, and criminal elements to a point where the traditional boundaries between them just completely vanish.
Yeah, and the sources provide a really striking historical case study on this convergence, which is the Haqqani Network.
Perfect example.
If we look at their origins back in the 1980s, they started out purely as a military resistance group fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. They had a singular military-focused ideological goal.
Right.
But over the decades, they didn't just remain a static insurgency. They completely transformed into this massive criminal, terrorist, and insurgent empire.
Yeah, the Haqqani Network is basically the textbook example of how adaptation works in irregular warfare. I mean, they engage in perfectly legal businesses.
Wait, legal businesses?
Oh, yeah. They hold massive real estate investments in the Arabian Peninsula. They run import-export companies. They own car dealerships. And they even fund hospitals and religious schools.
That's wild.
But the key is that those legal fronts aren't just, side investments for profit. They are fully integrated into their operational logistics.
Okay, let's break down the actual mechanics of that, because that is where the concept of convergence really becomes tangible. How exactly does a legal car dealership in a Gulf state translate into violence on the ground in Afghanistan?
It's all about layered financial and logistical links. So the car dealership generates legitimate, clean revenue, right?
Right.
That clean money is then used to purchase dual-use goods, so say fertilizer or commercial mining explosives. And they do this under the guise of a legitimate agricultural or construction project.
Ah, okay.
Then those goods are moved through the import-export front companies that the network also owns. Once those materials cross the border, the logistics cell takes over. They move the materials to the operational cell, which is the group that actually constructs the improvised explosive devices.
Oh.
And meanwhile, those legal profits are also funding kidnapping rings and extortion rackets, which in turn generate even more capital.
So it feeds itself.
Exactly. They use every single aspect of both their legal and illegal activities in this closed-loop system, which just makes the entire organization incredibly resilient.
Resilient. I want to focus on that word resilient, because historically, our approach to dismantling enemy organizations has relied on this sort of industrial age logic, right? We tend to view the enemy as a machine.
Yes.
If you want to stop an engine, you find the most critical gear, you smash it, and the whole mechanism grinds to a halt. But looking at how you just described the Haqqani Network's closed-loop adaptive structure, it functions much more like a biological organism.
That's a great way to look at it.
Actually, it's like a vast subterranean mycelial network, a fungus.
Okay.
You can kick over the mushroom that pops up above the ground, but the vast decentralized network of fibers underneath the soil just redirects its nutrients and sprouts another mushroom 5 feet away.
That is the perfect analogy.
So if these networks are so deeply entrenched and so decentralized, how do military planners even begin to find their actual weaknesses?
Well, the mycelium analogy highlights exactly why surface-level strikes are so futile. And to answer your question, we really have to look at a foundational concept cited in the text from Dr. John Arquilla. He states, in a network, everyone is number 3.
Okay, meaning that our traditional obsession with hunting down the head of the snake, the number 1 or number 2 leader, is a flawed strategy in this context.
Right. It's a strategy that yields severely diminishing returns. For years, there was this intense focus on targeting high-value individuals. But what strategists have realized, mostly through hard experience, is that simply taking out the leadership rarely produces lasting systemic failure.
Because they just replace them.
Exactly. Cellular networks are specifically designed for damage containment. Their power lies in their compartmentalization. When a leader is removed, the network simply morphs, adapts, and promotes the next person in line. The underlying mycelium is completely untouched.
So relying on a decapitation strike is essentially a temporary disruption, not an actual defeat.
Often, it just forces the network to evolve into an even more decentralized, harder-to-track configuration.
Wow.
Yeah. The text makes it very clear that lasting success requires a much broader systemic approach. You have to isolate the network from the relevant population, and you have to physically and financially sever its external support. You can't just target the people. You have to target the critical functions that allow the network to breathe, to move, and to regenerate.
Which brings us to the operational reality of how planners take this conceptual understanding and turn it into actual strategic action. I mean, how do we systematically target a network that actively wants to remain invisible?
Right.
The joint publication outlines a specific analytical framework called critical factors analysis. Let's really pull this apart because it seems to be the sort of analytical engine behind everything the military does in this space.
It is. Critical factors analysis is how planners dissect a complex, adaptive adversary to find the pressure points that will cause systemic failure rather than just a localized disruption. And it rests on 3 distinct pillars.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, we have critical capabilities. This asks the foundational question: what can the network actually do that makes them a threat? Like, what is their primary function in the operational environment?
Right. And a critical capability isn't something vague like, being evil. It's an actionable verb.
Exactly.
For example, a critical capability might be the ability to smuggle thousands of pounds of precursor chemicals across a heavily guarded international border.
Yes, that's a perfect example.
But knowing their capabilities is really just the starting point. It's not enough to build a targeting package, because a network can have the overarching capability to smuggle, but if they don't have the specific ingredients to make that happen, the capability is useless, which leads us to the second pillar, critical requirements.
Right. The critical requirements are the essential conditions, the resources, and the means that the network absolutely needs to execute that critical capability. So if their capability is smuggling chemicals, we have to map everything required to make that happen. They need off-road transport vehicles. They need a network of secure safe houses along the route.
Right.
They need secure communications to coordinate the drop-offs. And perhaps most crucially, they need border guards who are willing to look the other way because they've been compromised or bribed.
So the requirements are the necessary ingredients. But as a military planner, you can't realistically target every single requirement. You just don't have the resources to hit every truck, jam every radio, and arrest every corrupt guard simultaneously.
Yeah, you don't.
And that is where the third and probably most important pillar comes into play: critical vulnerabilities.
Yes. The critical vulnerabilities are the specific critical requirements that are currently deficient, exposed, or highly vulnerable to neutralization, interdiction, or attack.
So you're looking for the weak links.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Planners look at that exhaustive list of requirements and ask, which of these can we realistically disrupt to cause a cascading failure throughout the entire network?
But identifying a vulnerability is still really only half the battle. To figure out which of those vulnerabilities to actually strike, military planners don't just guess or, go with their gut.
Far from it.
We evaluate these vulnerabilities using a rigorous targeting matrix. It's known by its first letters, but let's walk through the full terms today. It evaluates criticality, accessibility, recuperability, vulnerability, effect, and recognizability. Planners grade potential targets across all these factors to prioritize where to actually apply pressure. Let's actually run a scenario through this matrix, because seeing how planners weigh these factors really exposes how difficult these decisions are.
That's a great exercise. Okay, let's say intelligence has mapped a network that is smuggling lethal aid. You have 3 potential targets identified as critical vulnerabilities.
Okay, what are they?
Target A is the primary financier of the operation, who happens to live in a luxury apartment in a neutral third-party country. Target B is the corrupt border official who physically allows the shipments through the checkpoint. And Target C is the primary physical safe house where the lethal aid is stored before it's distributed.
Okay, let's run them through the matrix. First up is criticality. How important is the target to the network's overall function?
Well, the financier is highly critical. Without money, the operation starves.
Right.
The safe house is moderately critical, but they could probably just find another building. And the border official is also highly critical because he represents the single physical bottleneck.
Good. Next is accessibility. Can our forces actually reach the target, either physically, legally, or digitally?
Well, the safe house might be highly accessible to a kinetic drone strike. The border official might be moderately accessible to a local law enforcement raid.
But what about the financier?
Right, the financier in the neutral third-party country. Physical or kinetic accessibility is practically zero because acting on it would trigger a massive international diplomatic incident. Exactly. Then we have vulnerability, which asks if we have the capability to actually destroy or neutralize the target once we access it.
Yeah.
And recognizability, which is whether we can positively identify the target in complex terrain, separating them from non-combatants.
Right.
But the two factors I really want to dig into are effect and recuperability. Because when dealing with adaptive networks, this is where planners face their absolute biggest dilemmas.
Yeah, let's focus on recuperability. In a conventional war, if we drop a precision munition on a massive multi-million-dollar suspension bridge, the recuperability of that bridge is incredibly low.
Right.
It will take the enemy years, massive engineering resources, and millions of dollars to rebuild it. The effect of that strike is virtually permanent.
But in the context of a threat network, the dynamics of recuperability are completely inverted.
Exactly. If we use a $1 million munition to bomb a dirt smuggling route in the desert, the recuperability for the adversary is immediate. They literally just drive their transport trucks 50 yards to the left.
Right. The network heals instantly.
Or let's look at target B from our scenario, the corrupt border official. We might arrest him, which achieves a great localized effect. But how quickly can the network recuperate? They probably have 3 other underpaid officials ready to take the bribe tomorrow. So how do planners weigh the desired effect against the adversary's recuperability?
It requires a fundamental shift in targeting philosophy. Hitting a target that can be replaced in 24 hours is just a catastrophic waste of strategic resources, unless it serves a broader, cascading operational goal.
Right, you're just mowing the grass.
Exactly. Mowing the grass. This is why the joint publication outlines 2 overarching engagement strategies that are specifically designed to handle highly recuperable networks. And the first is the fragmentation strategy.
Which focuses on breaking the cells apart internally rather than just destroying them from the outside.
Precisely. It targets the psychological and operational connective tissue. The goal isn't necessarily kinetic destruction. It's inducing paranoia. Yeah. Planners target the links between the cells to create distrust and force communication breakdowns. For example, through targeted information operations, or by selectively interdicting certain messages while deliberately letting others pass, you can make the leadership believe their logistics cell has been compromised by informants.
Oh, wow. So you essentially trick the network's immune system into attacking its own cells.
That's the objective. When you induce that level of paranoia, the cells are forced to isolate themselves for their own protection. They stop communicating, they stop moving resources, and they stop trusting one another.
Which paralyzes them.
Exactly. Even if every single insurgent or financier is still alive and physically unharmed, the network's overall capability plummets to 0. You have neutralized the threat without firing a single shot.
But a highly sophisticated network with intense ideological loyalty might resist that kind of fragmentation, right? If they trust each other implicitly, those information operations might fail. And that brings us to the second strategy, the counter-resource approach. Rather than trying to target the endlessly replaceable foot soldiers or, trying to bomb shifting dirt roads, you go after the lifeblood of the organization. You systematically starve the network of the exact inputs it needs to survive on a daily basis.
And regardless of a network's geographic location, its ideological fervor, or its operational sophistication, every single threat network on Earth shares one universal, undeniable, critical requirement. They all need money to function.
Which transitions us perfectly into the third segment of our deep dive. And honestly, this is the area where modern strategic thought is evolving the fastest.
Yeah.
The weaponization of money, specifically counter-threat finance.
Yeah, this represents a massive paradigm shift in how we conceptualize national security. Because for decades, the popular understanding of counter-threat finance was heavily skewed toward law enforcement.
Right.
People pictured federal agents tracking the bank accounts of South American drug cartels, or intelligence agencies freezing the assets of isolated terrorist cells in the Middle East. And while that tactical level work is absolutely still happening, the article by Strenger, Urban, and Mackay argues that counter-threat finance has evolved into something much, much larger.
How so?
It has become a premier strategic weapon in great power competition against rival state actors. We are talking about utilizing financial intelligence to counter the global ambitions of states like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
Okay, before we delve into the mechanics of how the Department of Defense actually does that, we need to clarify some critical terminology from the text, because the authors draw a very hard line between economic warfare and financial warfare. As practitioners, you really need to understand that these are not interchangeable terms.
They absolutely aren't, and conflating them leads to deeply flawed strategic planning. Economic warfare is a macro-level concept. It refers to broad, sweeping actions designed to degrade a rival nation's entire economy.
Like sanctions.
Yes. When you impose unilateral trade embargoes or implement wide-ranging international sanctions against a country's energy sector, or enforce a naval blockade to stop goods from entering a port, you are engaged in economic warfare. It relies on a massive imbalance of national power to coerce a state by inflicting widespread economic pain.
It's a blunt instrument. It's basically the economic equivalent of carpet bombing. It causes massive collateral damage to the civilian population and the broader global market.
Exactly.
Financial warfare, however, is a highly specialized subset of economic warfare. It's much more surgical. It specifically targets the monetary foundations of an adversary, their access to global capital, or seeks to disrupt particular high-value financial transactions. It's the economic equivalent of a sniper rifle.
And counter-threat finance is the operational arm that wields that rifle. It's the discipline of mapping the complex flow of adversarial money, analyzing those financial networks for vulnerabilities, and then executing targeted actions to deny, disrupt, or destroy that specific financial capability without necessarily crashing the entire global market.
The article lays out 3 distinct vectors for how the Department of Defense is applying counter-threat finance in today's strategic environment. Let's walk through the mechanics of each one, starting with the most recognizable, countering illicit finance.
So this vector targets the crime-state nexus we discussed earlier. It acknowledges a fundamental reality of modern geopolitics, which is that rival states rarely want to engage in direct, conventional warfare because the risks of nuclear escalation are just too high.
Right.
Instead, they use proxies, transnational criminal organizations, insurgent groups, or private military companies to achieve their strategic goals in the gray zone. Countering illicit finance means aggressively tracking the money laundering networks, the drug trafficking revenues, and the illicit arms sales that rival states use to covertly fund these proxy armies.
So if a rival state wants to destabilize a region without leaving fingerprints, they don't send their uniformed military. They funnel money through a network of shell companies to arm a local insurgency. And countering illicit finance is about exposing that hidden pipeline and freezing the assets before the weapons are ever purchased.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. It's the natural evolution of tracking terrorist financing. But the second vector is where I found myself genuinely stunned by the scale of the problem. It's a defensive posture called vendor threat mitigation. This is the rigorous process of ensuring that the Department of Defense does not inadvertently fund the very adversaries it's deployed to defeat.
And to a layman, the idea that the military could accidentally pay its enemies sounds absurd.
It sounds completely crazy.
Right. But when you look at the sheer scale of modern military logistics and the deeply opaque nature of globalized supply chains, it is a massive systemic vulnerability. The Department of Defense cannot operate independently. It relies heavily on thousands of civilian contractors and commercial technology vendors for everything from base construction to software development. Vendor threat mitigation is the intelligence process of rigorously mapping the financial ownership, the board of directors, and the deep background of those contractors to ensure no taxpayer money or sensitive operational data is bleeding over to an adversarial state.
And the text highlights a historical failure that perfectly illustrates why this is so critical: the 2011 Afghanistan host nation trucking contract. Let's break down the mechanics of how this disaster actually unfolded. The United States government needed to transport massive amounts of food, fuel, and building supplies to forward operating bases spread out across the really rugged terrain of Afghanistan. To do this, they hired local contractors.
Right. And on the surface, it seems like a logical logistical decision. You hire locals who know the routes, who know the terrain. But what military planners failed to map was the financial realities of the environment. The primary contractors didn't just drive the trucks. They subcontracted the work out to smaller companies, who then subcontracted it out again. And to ensure those trucks weren't ambushed along those perilous routes, those subcontractors paid massive protection fees to local warlords who controlled the territory.
And many of those local warlords were either directly aligned with or actively funneling money to the insurgency.
Yes.
Because the financial networks were so opaque, and because the contracting officers lacked the financial intelligence tools to see where the money was ultimately going, the result was catastrophic. It was eventually discovered through congressional investigations that roughly $700 million of United States funding had been quietly funneled directly to insurgents.
We were literally financing the procurement of the very weapons being used against our own forces. It was a brutal wake-up call for the Department of Defense regarding the absolute necessity of financial intelligence.
Yeah.
You cannot separate logistics from the financial battlefield. But what the article points out is that vendor threat mitigation isn't just an issue for chaotic war zones anymore. The threat has migrated into our domestic critical infrastructure. The text highlights a recent example involving the discovery of Chinese-manufactured batteries being integrated into the utility grid at the United States Marine Corps base, Camp Lejeune.
This is where the old burglar alarm analogy feels really insufficient. I mean, it's not just hiring a burglar to install your alarm. It's more like a supply chain Trojan horse built piece by piece in plain sight over a decade. You are essentially paying a strategic rival to implant hardware deep inside the nervous system of your most sensitive military installations.
Okay.
Because if conflict breaks out, that hardware could theoretically be manipulated to shut down the power grid of a base tasked with deploying forces.
That is the exact strategic threat. Because of the labyrinthine nature of global corporate ownership, a seemingly benign, locally registered technology contractor bidding on a base contract might actually be a subsidiary of a holding company, which is heavily subsidized or outright owned by an adversarial state's intelligence apparatus.
Right.
Vendor threat mitigation uses forensic accounting and financial intelligence to pierce that corporate veil and expose those hidden links before the hardware is ever installed.
Which leads us perfectly to the third and frankly most aggressive vector of counter-threat finance. Countering fiscal subversion. This is where we step fully out of counterterrorism and into pure great power strategic competition. This is about continuously surveying the global financial terrain to prevent rival states from buying geopolitical influence through legal but deeply malign economic investments.
This is arguably the most complex battlefield of the 21st century. Adversaries like China and Russia recognize that they don't need to conquer a nation militarily if they can just own its infrastructure economically. They are aggressively using state-backed investments to gain strategic footholds, often targeting vulnerable developing nations. They might offer massive predatory debt financing to a country to build a deep-water port or a new telecommunications network. They know the developing nation cannot realistically service the debt.
Right. They know they'll default.
Exactly. And when the inevitable default happens, the rival state seizes operational control of the port or the network under the terms of the contract. They gain a massive military, logistical, and intelligence advantage without ever violating international law or firing a single bullet.
Debt trap diplomacy at its finest. But this raises a massive operational question. If you are a military planner, how do you even begin to tackle this? I mean, we know how to look at a topographical map and plan an ambush in a physical valley.
Right.
But if the battlefield is made of cross-border bank transfers, shell company registrations, and corporate acquisitions, how do we map a financial battlefield when the terrain itself is entirely invisible?
Well, the experts in the article propose a really fascinating conceptual leap. They argue we must adapt the traditional military terrain model and apply it directly to global finance.
Okay, let's hear it.
For generations, military planners have used a standard assessment framework to evaluate a physical battlefield. They analyze observation and fields of fire, cover and concealment, obstacles, key terrain, and avenues of approach. The authors argue that to fight a financial war, planners must apply those exact same concepts to the flow of capital.
Okay, let's really dig into the mechanics of this terrain model because it fundamentally changes how you view the world. If I'm an infantry commander looking at a physical map, cover and concealment means dense forests, deep ravines, or urban structures where I can hide my troops from enemy observation and fire. What does cover and concealment look like when we are talking about global finance?
In the financial domain, cover and concealment are the legal and structural mechanisms an adversary uses to obscure the true ownership, origin, and destination of their capital.
Like what?
Well, it's the strategic use of anonymous shell companies, registered in jurisdictions with strict corporate secrecy laws. It's the use of complex corporate trusts, where the legal ownership of an asset is separated from the beneficial ownership, making it nearly impossible for outside observers to know who actually controls the money.
Wow.
It's also the use of proxy third-party brokers, lawyers, or wealth managers who mask the identity of the state actor making the purchase.
So an adversary uses a layered network of shell companies in a tax haven as a dense forest to hide their financial maneuvers. That's brilliant. What about obstacles? On a traditional battlefield, an obstacle is a physical barrier, a minefield, a swollen river, or a tank ditch designed to slow down or channel the enemy's movement.
In financial warfare, an obstacle is a regulatory framework or a compliance mechanism. It's the deployment of targeted international sanctions. It's strict anti-money laundering laws and know-your-customer banking regulations that force financial institutions to verify exactly where money is coming from. These legal obstacles make it incredibly difficult, slow, and expensive for an adversary to move their capital freely without triggering alarms or having their assets frozen by international watchdogs.
And then we get to key terrain. In conventional doctrine, key terrain is a geographic feature, like a high mountain pass or a critical bridge over a major river that offers a decisive advantage to whichever force controls it. You absolutely must hold the key terrain to dictate the terms of the battle. What constitutes financial key terrain?
Financial key terrain is entirely about access and structural control. At the macro level, the ultimate key terrain is access to the international banking system, specifically clearinghouses and global financial messaging networks.
Okay.
If a nation-state is cut off from that key terrain, their ability to conduct international trade effectively suffocates. But at a more granular operational level, financial key terrain could be the majority ownership of a specific critical asset within a targeted region.
Give me an example of that granular key terrain.
Imagine a rival state utilizes a web of front companies to legally purchase the majority shares of a developing nation's primary electric grid, or they buy out the sole telecommunications provider for an entire region.
Yeah.
By controlling that specific corporate entity, they now hold the key terrain of that entire country. They control the lights, the power, and the flow of information. They have achieved strategic dominance without deploying a single soldier.
And finally, we have avenues of approach. In a kinetic fight, this is the physical road, the highway, or the valley that an advancing force uses to move into position to attack the enemy or seize the key terrain.
Right. Avenues of approach in the financial domain are the legal and structural vehicles used to inject capital into a target environment. This includes foreign direct investment, where state-backed enterprises buy equity in foreign companies. It includes the predatory debt financing we discussed earlier. And it includes the outright acquisition of vulnerable, critical technology startups that possess dual-use capabilities. Intelligence analysts and military planners must continuously monitor these financial avenues of approach to see exactly where the adversary is advancing their capital long before a geopolitical crisis actually erupts.
It's a complete paradigm shift for the military mindset. We are rapidly realizing that a quiet wire transfer or a seemingly routine corporate merger can be just as dangerous, if not significantly more dangerous, than a ballistic missile when it comes to securing long-term strategic dominance.
And this realization highlights why counter-threat finance cannot be treated as solely a military endeavor. It requires a massive whole-of-nation approach. The Department of Defense simply doesn't have the legal authority or the unilateral capability to fight this war alone. They have to operate in seamless integration with the Department of the Treasury, the broader intelligence community, law enforcement, and allied international partners. The military might possess the advanced intelligence apparatus to map the adversary's financial network and identify the critical vulnerabilities, but they often rely on the Treasury Department to actually drop the hammer by implementing sanctions or freezing assets.
The coordination required is just staggering. So, to summarize the incredibly dense journey we've been on during this deep dive, we started by looking at the fundamental anatomy of the modern threat. We saw how adversaries are no longer organizing themselves into rigid, hierarchical military structures, but rather into highly adaptable, decentralized networks made of interconnected nodes, links, and specialized cells.
Right.
We explored the concept of convergence, seeing how the lines between terrorist, insurgent, and criminal enterprises have completely blurred, as demonstrated by the resilient, closed-loop system of the Haqqani Network.
We then transitioned into how military planners actually deconstruct and target these organizations. We broke down the critical factors analysis framework, distinguishing between a network's capabilities, its required ingredients, and the specific vulnerabilities that can be exploited.
Right.
We also looked at the harsh realities of targeting highly recuperable networks, understanding why taking out a replaceable node is often less effective than employing a fragmentation strategy to induce internal paranoia or a counter-resource strategy to starve the network of its lifeblood.
Which ultimately brought us to the most critical resource of all capital. We explored how following the money and actively countering the weaponization of global finance has evolved from a tactical law enforcement tool into a premier weapon in strategic great power competition.
Exactly.
We looked at the critical necessity of vendor threat mitigation to protect our own supply chains from subversion, and we examined how military planners are adapting traditional kinetic terrain models to map and defend against the invisible avenues of approach used in financial warfare.
And if you take one overarching lesson from these three foundational texts, let it be this. Your ultimate goal is not merely to map the nodes or track the money. Your goal is cognitive adaptation. The operational environment is constantly shifting, and the adversaries you face thrive in the ambiguity of these gray zones.
Yeah.
The traditional linear rules of warfare will fail you here. You have to train yourself to look beyond the physical geography, to look past the superficial structure of an organization, and to recognize the hidden, intersecting networks that are truly driving the conflict.
Which brings me to a final lingering thought for you to ponder as you continue your studies. We've talked extensively today about how nation-states track, manipulate, and weaponize the traditional centralized global banking system. We've discussed global financial messaging networks, corporate registries, and international sanctions. But we are currently witnessing a massive technological revolution in how value is stored and transferred. As global finance becomes increasingly decentralized with the explosive rise of anonymous digital currencies, untraceable blockchain technologies, and non-traditional peer-to-peer banking platforms that exist entirely outside the regulatory control of any single nation-state, how will the Department of Defense redefine its concept of key terrain when the financial battlefield no longer has any borders, central banks, or visible avenues of approach at all?